Today's episode is the first episode of our second podcast series brought to you by the Realist Idealists called The Catalyst. This podcast series is the history arm of the Realist Idealists podcast channel. We didn't want this to be your typical history-related podcast series, where you take a single event and discuss it in detail, because let's be honest, you can already find enough of those out there. Now, we still want to take a look at things like important events or inventions and people from our shared history, but our focus is more on how these things are some of the keys for creating the modern world as we know it today. Instead of focusing on one event or person, we will be looking at multiple events or time periods or people, all of which have been shaped by this original historical topic, or in other words, a catalyst. Sometimes the connection may seem obvious, but oftentimes we take for granted why the world is the way it is. Now, Jordan and I both love history, though I still consider Jordan to be more of the history buff out of the two of us, which is part of the reason why I brought Jordan into this entire project in the first place. I think the best part about it is that though we both have a bunch of overlapping knowledge, we also have areas where the other is more versed. But really, it's about our love for history and why we think everyone should take a little bit more time to learn about it that this podcast series is all about. It is our hope that through this series that you will learn to get a sense of why it's important to really understand our history, and hopefully in doing so, it will shape your perspective on how you view the world as we look towards our future for what is possible. And with that, I'd like to welcome you to the first episode of The Catalyst.
Okay. So, first being documented by Western historians in the Black Sea region in the mid-1340s, the bubonic plague, or the Black Death as it came to be known, quickly, violently ravaged the populations of Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. And what today we'll be looking at is how the massive decline in population in most of the civilized world at the time led to the collapse of the feudal system. The crush on the population effectively put an end to serfdom in Europe, and what we will see is how this put history on a path that without it, in some of the greatest events in history, may not have happened, or in other cases may have taken many centuries to play out. So from the Black Death to the American Revolution, we're going to try to examine with you this well-known but at the same time little understood event that shaped the coming of modern societies, and how a cascade of events starting with the Black Death would shape geopolitical outcomes on the other side of the world for hundreds of years. And we will attempt to examine this through three main points throughout our conversation. And as always, he's Brayden, I'm Jordan, we are the Realist Idealists, and this is The Catalyst. So going off of the collapse of feudalism, so essentially looking at what that was that in Europe in the Middle Ages, there was, well, I shouldn't say Europe, in most of the civilized world at the time in the Middle Ages, there was overpopulation. The population was very urbanly concentrated. So people were living in towns in large numbers and in close quarters together. And when the Black Death came through, it wiped out, they think in Europe, at least half is the higher estimates of almost the entire population in about a 7-year time span between 1346 and 1353. So because of that, you had a loss of the peasants, because most people at the time were working in farming, or if you were doing anything besides that, it'd probably be blacksmithing, which obviously wasn't that as many blacksmiths. But the collapse of the population meant that the nobles that were left didn't have enough people to work their lands and to keep up with the pace of harvest and everything that was constantly,
Yeah, I do have a question for you, just
Yeah.
for our audience sake.
Yes. Yeah.
Do you mind explaining what serfdom means? And indirectly, I feel like you just kind of did, but
Yeah. No, but just to get a broader sense, thank you.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So I don't know, like I don't know if they teach it this way anymore, but like when we were in grade school, when we learned about like medieval Europe, I remember this. There's this big chart. It actually kind of does like visually help break it down. Where it's the way the feudal system worked was you'd have like the kings at the very top. It's almost like a pyramid, right?
Yeah.
So like very few people would be in the nobility, and that was, as we know, usually divinely inherited. The royal family, the next to
Yeah.
the king, would and then take over, and usually then they would have nobles, which would be like the royal family's entourage, which
Yeah.
we've all seen that with Kate and everybody. So, and then from down there, you usually about the same level of status would be the church as the
Okay. Yeah.
nobility.
Yep.
And from there, so we're just now kind of coming down about like third of the way through the pyramid, because now we're getting down into the majority of the population, which would
Okay.
have
Yeah.
been the peasantry, and they were laboring to keep the kings and the nobles not just obviously fed and clothed, but to help it expand their kingdoms, maintain their kingdoms. But there was no say in who got to admit it. Like it was a system of inheritance. So you took the orders from whoever the nobility was.
Yeah. Like the idea that the majority of people were peasants, and those peasants kind of had no ownership over their
Of
lives, right?
anything, correct. And
Like
they're
if you were growing crops, you were instructed to grow these crops by your kind of
correct.
king
And
or
they would
lord
provide
or
you shelter and safety inside their
yeah.
castle. And that was, you didn't earn a living, you were just given enough to survive on
Yeah,
in
you didn't
exchange for your
own your
labor.
land and all that kind of
Correct.
stuff. It
Yeah, the
was
little thatch huts we would see in like an old medieval movie. Like no, none of the peasants owned those. That was the king's land, the king's house. He could come and kick you out of it, burn
take
it
it
down.
whenever. Yeah.
Correct. And any of the nobles, if they wanted more land, and the king said, "Yes, I want my entourage happy," well, he's going to clear out room from the peasants to make room for his nobles.
Yes.
And they don't have a say, even though they're the ones providing the backbone of the labor to keep the kingdom functioning.
And to your point, right, and what you said, the majority of the population
Yes,
represents
yeah, like the
that
big
class,
pyramid.
the
We're looking at
serfs.
like the
Yeah.
half of the pyramid down is
Yeah.
it's is in that kind of in that serfdom status, because even people like blacksmiths,
Yeah.
they were valuable because there was fewer of them amongst the population,
Yeah.
but they weren't irreplaceable. The king could, if
Hmm.
he didn't like the way a blacksmith was talking about him, he can have him and his family removed, and
Yeah.
that is his law. Like that's, and they had no right to the land if they were exiled out. That was
Well,
it.
that's perfect. I appreciate you explaining all those
Yeah,
things.
no,
I think
yeah.
it's good for context, especially when talking about the Black Death, as you have been, with the fact that right this large amount of the population as a
Correct.
whole was kind of wiped out.
Yes, and to your point, it actually really, I can't get into the next part of how this kind of starts a domino effect in history, where the Black Death happens, and now this, for the next, I guess, 400 years or so, it's history gets really busy.
Yeah.
And it starts with the loss of the population in these areas, where now that the labor was still required, the nobility and the royalty now had to offer more to the form, like to the people in the serf classes, to have their labor, to make sure that in at the time society kept running. So with all of the people who would harvest the wheat and that dead, the people who were left would have to do double the amount of work. And
Yeah.
with so much people gone, the royalty, most royalty in Europe and in medieval kingdoms, weren't able to actually provide themselves through their own labor the things they needed to survive. So to keep that, they started offering these peasants private land that they could own once they've finished their work. And what
Okay.
happened after that is you start seeing, mostly in Western Europe, actually pretty quickly too, like right around, I So like 1400, I guess. There was some peasant revolts just after the Black Death ended, because in 1353 there was a 20-year period where um, after the lords wanted to kind of go back to the previous system without paying the peasants for their work or
Yeah.
giving them plots of land to live on after they've completed like a season's harvest, and that caused a bunch of peasant revolts, which allowed that larger segment of the population to now keep more of the wealth they've earned, and it allowed them to start buying things as well for themselves. And that kind of started the rise of what we look at today as the merchant class in Europe, and in places like Italy and Spain and in England, where these people would be brought into the land. They would work for the church for 6 months, and they would be paid a fee, and then they go back and work for the nobility, and then the nobility would give them title deeds to like land. So it's like your family worked here, so you get a little plot of land after the harvest, and this is now your land and your property. And these people started generating purchasing power. They would start wanting goods as well themselves, like you and I would as well, like nowadays, right?
Yeah.
And well, back in those days, it was harder to move goods, and the luxury goods in places like the Far East would have to come over thousands of kilometers of land routes through like some of the most inhospitable places on earth. Like we know, like the Silk Road comes through China and through Siberia, and let alone the environment not being friendly to transfer all those goods and trade items. It
Yeah.
was also dangerous because you had the rise of the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean Sea area, which made it difficult for people going through Europe to try to use the Black Sea, because now that area was kind of in a bit of a war zone between the previous like Islamic the Khanates that were left there
Hmm.
in the region at the end. So that
Yeah.
if you even survived getting through that region, then you'd have to trek all the way through to Siberia. So a lot of the royalty in Western Europe started paying these now emerged merchant class people that said, hey, you know what? We can do a joint venture. I'm going to pay you some money, and you're going to go find a shorter route. And this is where we start, getting the guys like Magellan and and I don't know why I'm blanking right now. Christopher Columbus.
I didn't know who you were going to say there, and then the fact that that's who you said, I was like, yeah.
I feel it's
I don't
because
know why you're blanking.
we're
No, I'm just kidding.
Canadian, so like we don't recognize that like our country was founded by Christopher Columbus technically, but like
We don't have Columbus Day.
yeah, we don't have a Columbus Day. But Christopher Columbus was being paid by, I believe it was the Spanish government, to find a
Hmm.
shorter sea route to Asia. And as we all know, taking the shortcut, they stumbled onto where we are now, the New World. And so the Black Plague causes this rise in the majority of the population having more money, but it also now has the nobility and the royalty working with them to seek more and more goods and
Yeah.
seeking more luxury goods for themselves in far off lands because of all this pumped in capital now with the decline of the population from the plague. Within, I think, what was it, in 1456, I believe. Don't quote me on that 100%, but that's when Columbus landed in the New World. And he didn't just bring himself, he also brought the bubonic plague. And now Europe had already suffered this. By the time Columbus was in the New World, it's been about 70 years since the bubonic plague ended in Western Europe. So Christopher Columbus was never born aware that he had an immunity to something that the peoples in the part of the world he was now coming to had never been exposed to. So it's like a transfer and like a ripple effect almost, where you had the plague, and in Europe's mind now, it's long gone. It's been forgotten. 70 years in those days is 2 generations. So it's been 2 generations since the plague. These people are now living an entirely new life. It's a new world, and they discovered a new world and the people in it. And ironically, the bubonic plague ended up wiping out most of the people here as well in the form of smallpox. And it spread, and it, as we all know, went through the native population, and it triggered this event. And I kind of like to call it like the arms race of empires with powers in Europe, like growing national powers in Europe, because now that these nations have middle class, they have money to spend on navies. They can start policing the seas for their trade goods to keep up, so they're not losing anything from, well, they would do stuff to pirates, but the point of the Navy was it reduced that.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah.
but the thing is now you have these new lands that have now ironically been depopulated, mostly through disease, but also through violence. We all know that Cortez came and they fought the Aztecs, and there was wars here as well. But now all these powers in Western Europe, these growing national powers, had found an entirely new land resources, more than they would have expected, because instead of finding the East, they found something entirely else, entirely new, even more.
Mm-hmm.
And now these rising national powers started competing for not just the resource, but obviously the land. You had the French settle in where we are now in Canada and New France, and eventually we would have the 13 British colonies established in what is today the eastern seaboard of the United States, and as well as places like where my mom's from in the Yucatan Peninsula with Spanish colonists.
Mm-hmm.
And very quickly, that we were saying, I coined that term, like the race of empires. Within less than within 150 years of the end of the Black Plague, there were major European population settlements in North America. And within less than 100 years of that, most of North America east of the Mississippi had been completely colonized by Western European powers, which is a big, like, that's more land than they have in Europe when you think about it, right? It's a big, it's not a small task. And so I just wanted to see, we had wanted to go back and like look at the domino chain. So we had the Black Death, and then we had the rise of these merchants who now funded the New World, and now we have a rise of national powers with the population that has money, as well as not just money, but now they're also literate as well. Because in between that time, you had the Renaissance and all that stuff, right? Which is a whole nother big topic we can.
Yeah, it's crazy, even up until just this point, right? Like, so you're going to go even further.
Yes, yeah, because say we're in like the 1600s now, right? Like,
yeah, but it is so interesting that obviously a horrible event, like decimating families, but from that this value of labor that we see throughout the medieval era type of thing, into the Renaissance, that you get this kind of drive, right? Because I think it is so interesting that prior to, when you just had kind of kings and nobles were the only ones that kind of dictated what was going to really happen with the economies.
Correct.
Right?
Yes, it was very linear, bottleneck in that sense.
Very linear. And because also on top of that, they represent a very small population, right?
Yes.
And so if the only people in your society who have any kind of purchasing power is also like a very small population, you don't require kind of, or you don't have a desire to kind of gain all these extra things that you get out of, like, when we have this entire like kind of merchant class that kind of comes up, they also want things of their own, and that kind of drive to kind of explore, which I think you've already touched upon, right?
Find more goods,
yeah, right. Like, it's not even just the like kings and queens and nobles
now
that want to find a new way to
what used to be the lowly
India and
pleb,
China.
Is now someone, it might have been a lowly pleb 80 years before, is now coercing in conversation with the royal court, and they're working together.
Yeah.
And the court's
right?
like, all
Like
right,
that.
well, when you get back, we'll have some land for you. We'll build a house on it, but find some gold too while you're out there, or some
Yeah.
spices or chocolate, whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah. It's,
Chocolate? Yes,
yeah.
yes. Which
Right.
actually, there was a
It
point where
is.
chocolate was weighted more than gold at one point in Spain's history. Very briefly,
Yeah.
when they first made contact with the Aztecs, there was a point where like the cacao bean was insanely valuable.
Yeah.
And it was because people in Europe wanted it and there was the demand for it. Whereas before, the serfdom class never had disposable income from their labor.
Yeah.
And we're looking at
Yeah.
the birth of like you and I even now is we're a working class, but we own we work to own our own space.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
that basic idea kind of almost started there.
Yeah. Just in that shift, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And to your
Yeah.
point, you made a good point where like it's not only just that like they're working together to find these things, and it starts changing the way you look at how you do things philosophically too,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of governance, because as you go on with time, right, Britain and France established colonies here, and Spain. We all know that South America, like places like Peru and Chile, they started establishing. Which I didn't know there's like 30 million people almost in Chile. I was like, wow, man, that's
Mm-hmm.
and that like it's skinny, but like they got them in there.
Yeah. Yeah.
So these places they started, growing economically, population wise, to the point where, as we know, in the eastern seaboard here in the United States, the 13 colonies became very economically strong, powerful, and distinct from England after only
Yeah.
about 100 years. And again, this is because again, the plague that came with them to the New World, there was resistance from the natives, but it wouldn't have been the same if the smallpox hadn't worked its way through the population the way it had. And these colonies really quickly just exploded into these places. Like you got even places like Mexico City, which obviously Mexico kind of expanded out from there. But
Mm-hmm.
like even the idea that this metropolitan center was a powerful entity in its own right, from these separate from the bodies that entities and nations that founded them. And they started now developing their own identity because it's made up of populations that are not just wealthy, but they're also starting to become literate as well, because you have technological advancements in these time over the course of these period we've been talking about, like the printing press and stuff. And
Mm-hmm.
people en masse that can afford it start to become literate. And when they
Yeah.
start to become literate, they start to look at their relationship with the authority and government that runs the world they live in.
Mm-hmm.
And as we all know,
Yeah.
in the Americans' case, most famously known, is that they felt that they were paying and being taxed for an empire that didn't care about them and didn't have their interests in heart. And
Yeah.
then you have people coming to live there from Europe over the course of 200-300 years. And as these people are coming and they're living and they're working and they're developing skills, they're learning how to be independent, they're running nations under their own kind of civil structure. And within very little time of the New World colonies kind of becoming populous and economically unique, almost within no time of that, you see this explosion of colonial revolution,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I
which
feel like it's also like kind of connected with that is um the way that especially the New World colonies, but you could make the argument for just about any of the colonies that kind of spring up
yeah,
over this time, um, that the colonies were almost treated as like a way to kind of go back to serfdom, right?
yes,
Which,
correct, generate cheap
yeah, cheap labor, kind of let me just extract as many resources from
and
these places
exploit as many
and bring it
workers.
back to me at home, type of thing, right?
Correct. They get
Um,
the bare minimum they need to survive, and we bring 99%
yeah,
back here. Yes.
and I think it's a very like interesting point that, in particular for like the United States, um, it's sometimes lost that these colonists, right, the people that go to the United States, not only did they benefit from the things that you were saying from the education standpoint and just the access to information and building of skills from
And yeah,
just the
because
fact
it
that you
was
have to, right?
a less developed part of the world, you had to rely on more skills to make sure that if you wanted the same standard of living that you came from, you had to do more work.
Yeah, you had to be able
You had to
to
be a little bit more jack of all trades. It's like, and you had to,
100%. So
yeah,
it's all of those things, but it's never, it shouldn't be lost that these are also the people who, though some obviously some colonists left the old world, quote unquote, um, uh, as relatively poor, right?
yeah,
Because they're just trying to find a better life, but they also are the people that have benefited and learned from the ending of serfdom.
correct,
So the value of their labor is in the back of their mind. Very different than some colonies where they didn't necessarily go through that same kind of revolution that happened, right, with the
correct,
bubonic plague.
yeah.
Um, the kind of
It's very true, like especially
colonists,
in the Far East, because they suffered it in the
yeah,
same time as Europe. And
yeah,
when Europe showed up there, it was very much to your point. They didn't have the same mindset in terms of how their labor was valued.
yeah, because they've always had like the
That's
equivalent of
feudal,
slaves and
or that
or
feudal
right,
style
like yeah,
system, for
feudal
lack of a better, yeah.
systems
Because even
that
Russia, for the most part, continued on with that. Like
yeah, where you really have like
longer
this
than
idea
most,
of kingdoms with like kings and monarchies at the
and the
top
people
that just
don't
kind
own
of
anything.
rule
Yeah,
everything, right?
correct. Yeah, nobody owns
Um,
every. It's just them. Yeah, it's
yeah, and so when you have all these like French, Dutch, British colonists that are coming into,
and it's a mix of people too. To your point, like you said,
yeah, right,
you got Germans and you have British and French and
yeah,
native and yeah,
right, like so it is like it almost should be no surprise that you see that the United States is the first to kind of really spark that trend of
correct.
revolt, right?
Yes,
Uh,
and they had a few things going for them in terms of the population density
yeah, yeah,
and the fact that all 13 colonies had one common language,
yes,
almost ubiquitous, where they all the leadership from each colony can kind of get together behind England's back, and there was no communication breakdown or anything like that.
hmm, yeah,
And again, like to your point, it's people coming over with this similar mindset of that, oh, I can not just establish a better life, but I can in myself become a little king or lord or whatever.
hmm,
Because what we were saying, like this whole rise of the merchant class was when the huge crush on the population, people then started having a higher expectation for what their labor was worth. And you
yeah,
see it kind of get exponentially more, almost incrementally every century, from the end of the Black Death right up to the start of the American Revolution, to the point where when the American Revolution starts, you have common people like, I guess Benjamin Franklin was kind of a commoner. He might have come from a little bit of money, but that's the point, is that 200 years before that, there wouldn't have been that many people in the working level society that came
hmm,
with that kind of
yeah,
understanding of and wealth kind of thing.
yeah. The idea of a meritocracy being valued in
Thank you.
society, right?
Yes, yes, yeah. And
Yeah,
well, and that's the thing too, because now you have, we all know the American Revolution's 1776 is, it's hard to keep a TV on a Sunday for too long if you have like cartoons running like or something. It always gets brought up. But so we have that, this the start, like the American Revolution was kind of the first, where now
hmm,
these colonies were populated by working class, mostly working class people who had a bit of purchasing capital, who had a bit of understanding and were self-sufficient.
and a promise for a better life, right? Like that was
Yes,
the main drive for all these
that
colonists to come to the new
live in a
world, quote
more
unquote. Yeah,
you live
air
more
quotes.
freely and less under the rule of one or two or three people. It's
Yeah,
more of the
yeah,
idea that the community runs the system, and not the the aristocracy, I should say,
yeah. You're not
or
dealing
loyalty.
with a history, so to speak, that weighs
Correct.
over you,
Yes, and
right?
that's to your point earlier as well. Where in the other places where colonies were established, like in the Pacific, that was still very much a thing because the bubonic plague affected them at the same time as it affected Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And to your point, you have other places like I think because yeah, you had the American Revolution 1776. I'm just trying to I think
Well, like the French
with
Revolution.
the French Revolution was very shortly after that, and then
Yes.
you have it kind of spreads again into South and Central America because a lot of like the Mexicans officially 1809, but they were already by I think it was 1806 it actually started. And you think about it, 1806 and 1789, that's the difference between 1989 and 2006, right? So it
Yeah.
seems like a bit of time, but you got to think back then
It's
communications
really
were
not.
slower. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it'd take 2 weeks to get a message just from like England to Newfoundland. And that's hopefully it doesn't get washed out, the ship doesn't sink and
I
everything's
would have,
written.
to be honest with you, I would have thought it was even longer than
Yeah, I know you're probably right.
that.
You know what I'm thinking is because the Battle of New Orleans, so the War of 1812,
Yep.
was actually fought 2 weeks after the Treaty of Ghent was signed in Brussels. But because it took so long, by the time that they got news the war was over, they're like, oh, oops.
They're just, yeah.
Whoopsies.
Yeah.
But yeah, you have within very little time of these colonies being established, and like you're saying, the people have a mindset that they want more. They can have more. I should say it's not that they want more, but they know they can have more. That they know that
Well, or that they're worth more,
and they're worth more as well. Correct.
right? That
Yeah.
it's this idea, the kind of the sparking in the enlightenment of the fact that your labor, the fact that you are doing the job that you are doing matters, right?
Yes.
If it didn't matter, then you wouldn't be doing it, right? It's that kind of awakening that happens with a lot of people of that era, and arguably kind of continues forward even to today, that you should be treated a certain way and not exploited for the things that you're providing, right?
Correct. And to your point, like then you start looking at like how power is disseminated differently,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay.
and in like how your relationship with it and the people who enforce it take relationship. And to your point, like
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of like you're saying, we can follow the domino trail back, like you put it in reverse and you see them stacking back up,
Mm-hmm.
and you go to back to the Black Plague, and where most of our ancestors, I guess, would have probably been living at the time, would have never known the idea of working for personal property and gain. That you put in time to is trying to think of but your time is valuable. So if you're going to give your time
Mm-hmm.
in to somebody else, that you get something back out of it. Whereas it really did take the plague, the bubonic plague, for that to happen in Western Europe, for that to kind of evolve within a few centuries.
Yeah. Yeah, because you really have to, like, um when you really start to think and understand what it means to have a king or a queen or an emperor or a pharaoh or whatever, right?
Yeah, yeah,
What it really means to have a society that's built around something like that. It means that they own everything, and that you are just there to provide for their needs. And
and
in
yeah,
return, you will,
you'll be fed and you'll probably be sheltered
yeah, or
at
the
the
like
bare,
kind
like
of hope that you will receive their quote unquote their love, right? Like
yes,
in that
yes,
sense, it's
yeah, to the Pharaoh case, yes,
yeah, right? Because
yeah,
kings and queens and all those things are supposed to be looked at as gods, right?
correct, yes, they
And so
always
it's
have some
like,
form of
I give to
divine.
you, and then you give me your love back, right? Like,
Yes, and the gods will love
it's,
you, and yes,
yeah,
yeah, yeah, and life
right?
will be
Like
good, and your babies
that's the
won't get sick.
mentality.
Yes, yeah,
Yeah, right? Like, because when you have one or very few people who control every aspect of your life, the good and the bad feels directly connected to those people, right? And that, like, for us, I feel like nowadays
we take it
we
for
just
granted
are
a
like,
little bit.
you almost take advantage of the fact that, like, we know that that's kind of
It's
a little
just
bit ludicrous,
ingrained
right?
into our it's ingrained.
Yeah.
And you think about it, that's only. I'm sorry, I'm just gonna get the calculator out because I am so bad with numbers, or at least subtraction in my head. I don't know why. It's
Fair enough.
addition,
Fair enough.
no problem. Subtraction, whoa.
What are our numbers we're talking about here?
Well, we're 2023 already, eh? So 13. So I'm just looking. So the Black Plague ended 670 years ago.
Yeah. Okay.
So to look at it on a time scale of human civilization, if you go back to just say Egypt, so say 3000 BC. So from then up until 1353, as far as we're aware, people were used to living as you're born either a peasant or a king. And you don't get to choose and move up in life. Like, you're just born a peasant, you work the land, you live bare minimum, you hope that your king is competent enough that your kingdom isn't overrun or your village isn't burnt down or whatever, and that the food is distributed at least kind of evenly, which we know throughout most of history it wasn't.
Yeah.
And then you have this awful, awful, tragic thing as the Black Death, where just to fathom the fact that even if it was 1 in 3 people in a 7-year time span, it's just crazy to think about.
Yeah.
And since 1353, it's kind of triggered a chain of events that kind of built us up to where we almost, like, how we kind of see the framework of our societies now, kind of where they came from, how we've built around that shell, for lack of a better word.
And to that point, right? Like, kind of going, I guess, a little bit back slightly, just because you said something there. Yeah. Both with the American Revolution, right? And you can make the argument like the Magna Carta. All of these things are built around this principle that, like, all men are treated equal, like,
created equally.
Yes, created equal.
Like
you said, not treated, created equal, right?
Yeah,
like,
that's a very
so the
good,
Magna Carta is that idea that, like, even the king is held to the same standards as a lowly peasant, right?
Yeah.
That they aren't above the law in that sense. And obviously the Declaration of Independence is the exact same
and that
thing.
Gives us our idea of understanding of what we still even today is: I have the right to work, to have land, and have property.
Yeah. And
if we
when
all
the US
together,
does that, it sparks all, like, as we've already said, a bunch of other revolutions that are also built around that same exact principle.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah. Mexico, you see it, Bolivia, and these pushes for self, like, a different style of governance.
Yeah.
You see this the monarchy system being opted out and being chosen over a form of republic, or democratic republic, or in France's case it was just a republic. But
yeah. Right? But it is, right? Like, it is that you really do take for granted, and hopefully, like, I know you're continuing with some stuff here and there, but yeah, like, you really do take for granted this aspect of, we feel like democracy and human rights and all those things are just like a no-brainer, right? Correct. Like, it's like, this is what it is.
You wouldn't think anything otherwise, right? In this day and age. And it's like, where did that come from? Because
where does that come from? And I think it's also, even in saying that, it also reminds me how important it is to remind ourselves of those things when, like, I don't want to get too much of a off topic or whatever, but a lot of times you've seen over the last 20, 30 years, really, you could make an argument of even longer than that, but of the quote unquote West, right? Like, the Western powers, going into places around the world and trying to do regime changes and all those kind of things, right? To bring democracy to the world. And we ask ourselves like why that fails often, a lot of times, right?
Yeah.
And it's
So,
that idea that you can't, you almost need sometimes those cataclysm events to shake up the
set in
system.
motion. Yeah.
Yeah, because just you would never, like, to your point, what you said right in the beginning of this episode, I think that a lot of these things maybe right,
Might
like
not
you
have
can
played
only
out the same way.
hypothesize
But
whether or
who
not
knows?
this would have
Without the
happened,
without the
but you
Black
could make
Death, would
the
Christopher Columbus been here in 1556, or would it not have been until 1656?
yeah,
Right?
you could make the argument, I think, that the world would have Europe would have found North and South America eventually,
Eventually,
right? I would make that the argument that someone eventually would decide to explore, right? I think it's very human nature to explore.
And we know the
but
Vikings did.
well, yeah, exactly, right?
They forgot too. So.
before Mr. Columbus came on over.
They forgot too.
Yeah, and they forgot as well, right? But you could make the argument of those things, but I think it's a fair, a bit of a fair argument to say that it's harder to say that. What am I trying to say here? That the idea of all men and women, people of this world,
being created equal,
that kind of essence, that value of labor, the value of life, the valuable whatever, history would say to you that that isn't the case. Obviously there has been revolutions that have happened, riots and like overthrowing of different things, right?
But dictators and kings and
right, like whatever,
kingdoms
Rome dealt with a lot of things, right? Like lots of these of empires and kingdoms have dealt with that stuff. But there is still the common theme or whatever you want to say about it, that it just really goes from like one empire to the next, right?
Correct.
Or one kingdom to the next, right?
It's
like you kill off one king to like put a new king up.
And nothing changes. Right?
Nothing really changes.
Just the names and the faces, and
and that's such a, again, I'm not saying that I could say for certain that there's no way that we would have the value of life come out without the bubonic plague. But you could also make the argument that that might actually have been the case, right? Because, yes, history has whatever. The Greeks, Athens had a democracy, right, before anyone else, right?
Loose form,
loosely a democracy, because it was a very limited democracy.
They still had slaves.
They still had slaves. Only men that had own property could do it, right? But blah blah.
Not the same idea that we're working with today, very much. And
right?
That's to your point, is that, and a lot of people, that's the thing. I think it's a kind of almost like an in conclusion, but because this is something that will obviously. This is going to come up again anyways in another conversation, because the plague does affect
some dimension or another.
Yes.
Right? Yeah.
But that's the thing, when people are thinking, oh, well, like the structure of the world we know today was born out of the thinkers of the American Revolution, right?
Mm-hmm.
That idea for but those events would not have happened the way they did, and in the nature and the timing they did, without the Black Death.
Yeah.
Because you had to have all those other events lead up to that without having the crazy depopulation crush.
Without having that catalyst.
Exactly. Without having that domino catalyst. You needed that one to fall over, and you don't notice it. You don't see all these events playing out or actually leading up to.
Yeah, those building blocks.
Correct. Yeah. And it kind of just, you wouldn't see it differently. So I like looking at it. It's interesting, because it's something that I feel like I take for granted all the time too.
Oh yeah, I think everyone does.
Stop and think about it, and you're like,
man,
it's crazy. Like, it really, like, it's all connected, but you need to have something to set stuff in motion. And as we're gonna we'll talk about this and other catalysts, not just
Yes. Yeah.
events, but things, people, right? So, or
Yeah. Yeah.
inventions
Yeah.
that just one little thing, you're like, I had no idea. There's just like, without that, you wouldn't have all of this.
Yeah. Yeah. You do, because a lot of the things we just think, well, like right, like in the case of the American Revolution, you gravitate to this idea of
More empire
they
building
just
and yeah.
and that
But what
they
caused that empire building?
they
Like what caused
yeah,
nations
miraculous
to
enlightenment that we're
yeah,
like, no, we're gonna stand up to this and say no more, right? Like as if they were the first people ever to be oppressed in the world, right? Like
exactly. Yeah, yeah.
it's
It's like when I saw Jim Jeffries. He's like, I want you guys to understand something. You are the most progressive generation there has ever
yeah.
been. But just so you're aware, every generation before you has been the most progressive generation.
Yeah.
It's like, and when you think about it like that,
Yeah.
that's how we have our catalysts. Because
Yeah.
somebody, something, or someone, or it has to happen or come around
Yeah.
to start what we would consider the motion of events of history. It's
Yeah. For good and for bad,
yeah.
that's always the case, right?
Yeah.
It's our world and our creative thinking and all that kind of aspects of life always stem from something else, right?
Correct. And it's one of
The
those
only time I
things
think that you maybe or maybe let me rephrase this. This is why it's actually so important. And hopefully you're getting the sense even just from this one episode, but as we go on and do more and more episodes and Jordan as our history guru, as much as I love history, but will kind of take us on these mini journeys. Hopefully you understand the importance of knowing your history, because yes, you could make the argument because this was an event that it becomes a little bit more ingrained, right? The value of labor just happens because of the fact that they wipe out like a large population gets wiped out. It's hard to forget something like that.
Yeah, there's an unexpected collapse in the population.
Yeah,
yes. Yeah.
Right. But some of the other catalysts, so to speak, as we go on, it's so important that if that certain piece of technology or that the words of wisdom from a certain person or another event or whatever it may be,
who knows? Yeah,
right, if those things get lost to time, right, it's hard for those lessons to survive
again. Correct.
right?
Yeah.
Like that I think hopefully gets stressed the most of why we have this channel, or sorry, why we have this series connected with the Realist Idealist, right? How this understanding of history from a catalyst standpoint, again, using our name there, to really shape your perspective when it comes to just everything in life, right?
And just and even just paint, like fill in the picture that you wouldn't realize is
right. Like it gives you a clear perspective and a clear picture.
It's the idea
on anything
that to even just to take away the simple fact that if you learned something today that the collapse of feudalism due to the bubonic plague ended up leading to the American Revolution, and what we know is today is like our common relationship between population and government.
Yeah. Yep.
It all started with that one catalyst known as the bubonic plague, and from there it changed everything over the course of a few centuries. And that's the thing with histories, it takes a little bit to play out.
Yeah, to really see what the impact of
events
something's going to be.
Occurring in one century are usually because of the way something happened a century or two previously.
Mm-hmm.
And it's
that value of labor, that value of life, the relationship between those who govern versus those who
work and provide, I guess.
Are underneath that governance.
Yeah, the rest of us, I guess.
Yeah. all of those things, like you said, it is crazy and so important to look at it from that perspective of seeing how time shapes it all.
Yeah. And that's exactly it. It's the idea is, I can end it any way. The idea is, yeah, although the American Revolution and the idea of what we understand and the concept of a modern state today is, the events of the bubonic plague far back in the depths of the Middle Ages is where this came from.
Mm-hmm.
Or that at least is what set it in motion. It's the event that started the snowball down the hill.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it starts off as a little snowball, but by the time it's done, it's this giant constructed ice castle. It's very complex.
Yeah, it's all the things. It's all the things that we take for granted today, right? Like the idea of a middle class, the idea of
having
human rights,
a system of society where we all contribute and put in, and we get out equally together.
Yeah,
I think. Yeah.
Which really, when you think of it that way, you're like, how does this have anything to do with this natural, like,
disease,
plague? Yeah, like disease
and
that
fleas
happens,
spreads.
right?
Yeah. Well, that part we'll leave to the doctors, because.
Yeah. I was going to say, and I'm sure a medical historian would talk to you about a bunch of things connected to the advancements of with
comes
comes from the bubonic plague, which you could have a whole episode about those types of things. But I think we wanted to keep kind of big picture in terms of the social impact of how it's kind of affected us today to this point.
And broad spectrum effect of society. Yeah.
And hopefully you got the sense of that, right? Between, like, just to kind of recap, like Jordan went over, right? You had the bubonic plague happen
1346, and I guess we ended around 1810 if we want to talk about if we're going to hit at the end of the Mexican Revolution there. So
right. Like that's a huge span of time, but it's like massive death, the rise of the merchant class with the end of serfdom, the kind of from that rise of the merchant classes, the sparking of searching for new ways for trade, which then leads to
the rise
colonies
of
being established.
Nations.
Right. And then
all full
from
circle.
there, colonial like revolutions that kind of happen, and just revolutions for that matter as a whole, general, right? Obviously, France is not a colony. They had their own revolution.
Spain,
but, right?
Exactly.
The kind of, I don't want to say ending, but you could make the argument that, relatively speaking, the ending of kind of monarchies, or at least the ending of monarchies as we know it,
the feudal system,
topples over there, right? Like, you could make the argument that Britain still has their monarchy, right? The United Kingdom still has their monarchy, but their monarchy is a figurehead. Is not.
They don't go stripping, pulling people out of their homes anymore.
No, right? That ownership.
On a boat.
No, the government does that now.
Yeah.
But as a whole,
Black van just pulled up outside.
Yeah. As a whole, this idea of the feudal system of monarchies and
this chain events caused by the one catalyst event.
Yeah. And hopefully, in, like, obviously it started off horribly, but you could see that there have been a lot of positives that have come out of this. And hopefully, like, the weighting of the scales keeps tipping in the, like, positive impacts of something like the Black Death as we kind of go forward, right?
Yeah, and we'll get to look at other instances and some other things too, where we'll see how it affected certain things and whatnot.
Yeah.
And how they.
And I think you even mentioned earlier in this episode that some of the things that we're even going to be talking about, you could make the argument still even relate back to the fact of they don't happen, or kind of don't happen unless the Black Death, like the bubonic plague, happens.
We'll be back.
Yeah.
At some point, something's going to bring us back here.
Well, sir, is there anything you want to say to wrap things up here?
I think that was. I hope you guys can help see, or hope we helped you see the picture the way we see it, and maybe we'll all that'll help us all put a clearer picture together, because it takes everybody.
Most definitely. Well, I do appreciate you kind of taking the time. Jordan kind of went full force into this and made sure that he kind of did his research. Obviously, a lot of the stuff we were somewhat familiar with in the first place, but
yes, and
taking that time. Yep.
Braden can tell you, it's not hard to get me lost doing that stuff. It's just it's like it's like a dog.
Yeah.
It's like, you want to go do it, boy. All right. It's like, okay, you're going too far. Stop.
Yeah, you love your history, so
Yeah.
I on occasion have to reel you back in a little bit. But,
yeah, because I'll start branching off. Oh, did you see?
Yeah, but nevertheless, I appreciate you doing this. We hope to obviously, or not hope, we will be continuing this series with episodes here and there, kind of things that will hopefully spark, right?
Yeah,
like
maybe
that.
The next one won't be as maybe it might not be as sad as the Black Death. So
Yeah,
maybe we'll do something
we'll
cool.
Pick something a little bit more still impactful, but yet a little less death.
The invention of butter popcorn.
there you go.
Yeah.
But yes, nevertheless, hopefully that you guys have learned some things, and like George said, are seeing the value that we see when it comes to learning about history and what it can kind of really teach us about our present, as well as kind of where can we go from here. But yeah.
Sir. On that note, go Leafs, go.
Take care.